He believed one quiet mistake deserved a lifetime ban. But by sunrise, he was about to discover that dignity had a way of returning when pride least expected it. The dinner crowd at Belladonna House moved with the polished rhythm of crystal glasses, soft jazz, and conversations spoken just above a whisper. Every server understood that table 12 belonged to one man alone. Damien Calloway never asked for attention. He simply carried the kind of presence that made an entire room adjust itself without being told. Owners stood straighter when he entered. Managers checked every detail twice. Even regular customers lowered their voices without realizing why. To most of the city, he was an influential businessman whose investments seemed to touch every corner of downtown. To those who truly knew his name, he represented something much larger, a man whose decisions shaped futures with a single sentence. Brielle Sutton had worked evening shifts at Belladonna House for nearly 11 months, long enough to memorize every table, every favorite order, every regular customer who tipped generously, and every one who never smiled. She never chased conversations. She never tried to impress wealthy guests. Her grandmother often told her that respect did not arrive because someone demanded it. Respect arrived quietly, after people had exhausted every reason to deny it. Those words stayed with Brielle every time she tied on her black apron before another long shift. That Thursday evening looked ordinary until the restaurant manager rushed into the service station with unusual urgency. Damien Calloway had arrived 20 minutes earlier than expected, accompanied by several distinguished guests whose faces appeared on magazine covers more often than television interviews. The manager's instructions came quickly. Every plate had to be perfect. Every movement had to be invisible. Nobody was to interrupt the private meeting for any reason. Brielle nodded once, picked up a tray, and continued serving nearby tables exactly as she always had. She had learned years ago that panic only made simple work more difficult. As dessert was being prepared, a frightened elderly customer sitting near the entrance suddenly struggled to keep his balance while reaching for his cane. A glass slipped from the edge of his table, shattered across the floor, and rolled dangerously toward the narrow walkway leading to Damien's private dining area. Without hesitation, Brielle stepped away from her assigned section and hurried toward the older gentleman before anyone else noticed. She caught his arm just as he stumbled, steadying him with calm reassurance while carefully guiding him back into his chair. At that exact moment, one of Damien's guests paused mid-conversation as Brielle crossed briefly through their line of sight. It lasted no more than a few seconds. For everyone else, it was hardly worth remembering. For Damien, whose meetings depended upon precision and discipline, it was an unacceptable interruption. His expression hardened. The room seemed to lose its warmth. He slowly placed his coffee cup onto its saucer before looking directly at Brielle for the first time. His voice remained calm, almost gentle, which somehow made every word heavier. "You're done here," he said. "Leave, and don't ever come back." Silence settled over Belladonna House. Forks stopped halfway to plates. A pianist quietly removed his hands from the keys. The manager's face drained of color while several servers exchanged nervous glances. Brielle looked toward Damien for only a brief second. She did not argue. She did not explain why she had crossed the room. She did not mention the elderly customer whose hands were still trembling beside the entrance. Instead, she untied her apron, folded it with careful hands, placed it on the service counter, thanked the manager for the opportunity to work there, and walked toward the front door with the same quiet dignity she had carried into every shift. Behind her, whispers spread faster than footsteps. Some believed she had finally made a mistake too large to recover from. Others wondered why she had accepted the humiliation without defending herself. Damien never looked back as another discussion resumed around his table. To him, the evening had already moved forward. The decision had been made. The waitress would never return. At least, that was what everyone inside Belladonna House believed as the front door closed softly behind Brielle Sutton and the night disappeared around her. Brielle walked 6 blocks before the cool night air finally slowed her breathing. She did not look back at Belladonna House, and she did not allow herself to replay the faces that had watched her leave. Embarrassment could linger only if she invited it to stay, and she had learned long ago that tomorrow always demanded more strength than yesterday's disappointment. Her apartment sat above an old neighborhood bakery on the east side of the city, a building whose narrow staircase creaked with every step and whose windows rattled whenever the freight trains crossed the river after midnight. The place was small enough that the kitchen blended into the living room, and the living room blended into the bedroom where her grandmother, Lorraine Sutton, was already asleep beneath a handmade quilt that had been in their family for decades. Brielle quietly slipped off her shoes, placed her work bag beside the front door, and checked the weekly pill organizer resting on the kitchen counter before covering her grandmother with another blanket. Lorraine opened her eyes for only a moment. "Long night?" she asked softly. Brielle smiled with the same calm expression she had worn inside the restaurant. "Just a different kind of night." Lorraine studied her granddaughter's face for several seconds, noticing the missing apron and the unusual silence that surrounded her. She could have asked questions, but wisdom had taught her that the right answers usually arrived after a little patience. Instead, she reached for Brielle's hand and squeezed it gently. "Whatever happened, do not let someone else's anger decide who you become tomorrow." Those words followed Brielle into the kitchen as she prepared tea instead of dinner because there was little food left until payday, or at least the payday she had expected before losing her job. She opened a small notebook where every dollar of every paycheck had been carefully recorded. Rent was due in 9 days. Her grandmother's physical therapy appointment was scheduled for Monday morning. The electricity bill rested beneath the notebook with a bright red reminder printed across the envelope. None of those numbers frightened her as much as uncertainty itself. She had survived difficult seasons before. She would survive another one. Before going to bed, Brielle emptied the pockets of the black jacket she had worn during her shift. A folded receipt, a pair of spare hair ties, 2 peppermint candies, and then something unexpected slid onto the table with a soft metallic sound. It was a sleek black card holder made of fine leather, heavy enough to suggest it contained more than business cards. She stared at it, searching her memory until the evening replayed itself piece by piece. When she had rushed to steady the elderly customer near the entrance, she had brushed past the edge of Damien Calloway's chair. The card holder must have slipped from the inside pocket of his tailored jacket without anyone noticing. Brielle slowly opened it only far enough to identify its owner. Inside were several identification cards, private access credentials, and a handwritten note folded neatly between them. She immediately closed it again. Whatever else it contained was not hers to see. She knew many people would have handed it to the restaurant manager and considered the matter finished. Others might have searched for a reward. Brielle chose neither path. Something about the way Damien had spoken made her believe the card holder would never reach him if it passed through too many hands. By 6 o'clock the following morning, the city had only begun to wake. Delivery trucks lined the streets, coffee shops unlocked their doors, and the sidewalks slowly filled with commuters carrying steaming paper cups. Brielle stood across from Belladonna House wearing a simple navy sweater instead of her work uniform. The leather card holder rested safely inside a plain envelope she had sealed before leaving home. She took one slow breath, crossed the street, and reached for the polished brass handle. She had not come to ask for another chance. She had not come to defend herself. She had come for one reason alone. Some things belonged in the hands of their rightful owner, even if that owner had decided she no longer belonged anywhere near him. Belladonna House looked entirely different in the early morning. The chandeliers that had glowed with elegance the night before were now dimmed beneath the soft sunlight pouring through the front windows. The dining room echoed with quiet preparation instead of polished conversations. Chairs were being lowered from tabletops. Fresh linens replaced those from the previous evening. The comforting aroma of baked bread drifted from the kitchen while deliveries arrived through the rear entrance one after another. Brielle Sutton stepped inside carrying nothing except the sealed envelope held carefully against her side. She wore no uniform, no name tag, and no expression of expectation. Before she could take another step, the hostess recognized her. Surprise quickly became discomfort. Within seconds, 2 servers paused in the middle of arranging silverware. One whispered something to another. A dishwasher passing through the hallway slowed just enough to glance toward the entrance. News traveled remarkably fast inside restaurants, especially when someone had been dismissed by the most important guest the establishment had ever served. The floor manager, Leonard Pierce, emerged from his office with a clipboard still tucked beneath his arm. The moment he saw Brielle, his shoulders stiffened. "You should not be here," he said without greeting. His voice was lower than it had been the previous night, but no less firm. Brielle nodded politely. I only need 5 minutes. Leonard shook his head before she could continue. There is nothing to discuss. The decision was made yesterday. Several employees quietly gathered within hearing distance, pretending to polish glasses or organize menus while listening to every word. One young server exchanged an awkward smile with another and whispered, "I cannot believe she actually came back." Another replied, "Maybe she thinks he will change his mind." Someone near the service station muttered that Pride usually disappeared when rent became due. The comments were not shouted. They did not need to be. Every sentence floated through the nearly empty dining room with painful clarity. Brielle heard every one of them. She answered none of them. She simply held the envelope a little tighter. Leonard stepped closer and lowered his voice. "Listen carefully, Brielle. I always thought you were dependable, but this is making things worse." Mr. Calloway was perfectly clear. If he walks in and finds you here again, this restaurant could lose far more than one employee. Please leave before anyone has to escort you outside. Brielle looked at him with quiet sincerity. "I am not asking for my job back." Leonard frowned. "Then why are you here?" She glanced briefly at the envelope. "Something important belongs to him." Leonard extended his hand immediately. "Give it to me. I will make sure he receives it." For a brief moment, Brielle considered the offer. Then she remembered the weight of the leather card holder, the private identification inside, and the unmistakable feeling that it should never pass through unnecessary hands. She slowly shook her head. "I need to place it directly into his hands." The room grew even quieter. A line cook walking toward the kitchen stopped long enough to watch. One of the bartenders sighed impatiently. Another employee quietly laughed under his breath. To many of them, Brielle no longer looked like the calm coworker they had respected for months. She looked like someone refusing to accept reality. Leonard's patience finally began to fade. "You are leaving me with no choice." He gestured toward the security guard stationed near the entrance. The older guard, Harold Bennett, approached without hostility. He had worked at Belladonna House for nearly 15 years and had always greeted Brielle with a warm smile before every shift. Even now, there was regret in his eyes. "Miss Sutton," he said gently, "please do not make this harder than it needs to be." Brielle returned his kindness with a faint smile. "I promise I am not here to cause trouble." Harold looked at the envelope, then back at her face. Something about her calm confidence made him hesitate. She was not angry. She was not desperate. She was simply determined. Before anyone could speak again, the quiet rhythm of the restaurant changed. Conversations stopped. Kitchen staff looked toward the entrance. A familiar black sedan had just pulled to the curb outside the front windows. Leonard's expression immediately tightened. Harold straightened his jacket. Every employee instinctively returned to work as polished shoes approached the front door. Damien Calloway had arrived far earlier than anyone expected, and Brielle remained standing exactly where she was, the sealed envelope still resting quietly in her hands. Damien Calloway entered Belladonna House with the same measured confidence that had silenced the dining room countless times before. His charcoal overcoat rested neatly across one arm, and the morning sunlight reflected against the polished marble floor as every employee instinctively straightened their posture. He acknowledged no greetings beyond a slight nod toward Leonard Pierce before continuing toward his private meeting room. Then his eyes settled on the one person he had expected never to see again. Brielle Sutton stood exactly where she had been moments earlier, calm, composed, the sealed envelope resting quietly in both hands. She neither stepped forward nor attempted to stop him. She simply waited. Damien's expression remained unreadable, but the temperature of the room seemed to drop. Leonard hurried toward him before Brielle could speak. "Sir, I was just asking her to leave." Damien never took his eyes off Brielle. "Then why is she still here?" His voice was steady, controlled, and almost conversational, yet every employee within hearing distance immediately stopped pretending to work. Leonard cleared his throat. "She says she only needs 5 minutes." Damien answered without hesitation. "She had her opportunity yesterday." Brielle listened without interrupting. Her breathing stayed even. She had promised herself before walking through those doors that she would not defend her pride. Pride was temporary. Integrity lasted much longer. Damien finally addressed her directly. "Did you misunderstand what I told you?" Brielle met his eyes for only a brief moment before answering respectfully. "No, sir." "Then explain why you ignored it." "Because something belongs to you." Damien glanced toward the envelope but showed no curiosity. Instead, he interpreted her return exactly as everyone else had. Another employee hoping for forgiveness. Another conversation that should never have happened. If this is about your position here, you are wasting your time. Brielle quietly shook her head. It is not. If it is an apology, I do not need one. It is not that either. Damien folded his arms. Then give it to Leonard. Brielle held the envelope a little closer. I cannot. A faint murmur passed through the staff gathered around the dining room. Some exchanged puzzled looks. Others quietly assumed she was creating unnecessary drama. Damien's patience thinned by another degree. He had built his reputation on clear decisions and consistent standards. Allowing exceptions invited confusion, and confusion invited weakness. You seem determined to test boundaries that were already settled, he said. I am not testing anything, Brielle answered softly. I only came to return what is yours. Damien looked toward Harold Bennett, whose uncertain expression revealed that even the veteran security guard did not believe Brielle intended any disruption. Still, Damien spoke with unmistakable authority. Escort Miss Sutton outside. Harold hesitated for only a fraction of a second before taking 2 careful steps toward her. Miss Sutton, he said gently, please come with me. Brielle nodded politely, making no effort to resist. As Harold reached her side, she slowly lifted the envelope and spoke only 4 words. This belongs to you. She extended it toward Damien without moving another inch. Something about her tone caught him off guard. There was no desperation in her voice. No resentment. No expectation. Only quiet certainty. Damien accepted the envelope almost absent-mindedly, more to end the encounter than from genuine interest. He looked down at the plain white paper. There was no name written across the front. No message. No explanation. For a brief moment, he considered handing it back unopened. Instead, perhaps out of simple curiosity, he broke the seal. The room remained completely silent as he reached inside and withdrew the black leather card holder. The change in his expression was almost invisible, yet unmistakable to anyone watching closely. His eyes narrowed. His posture stiffened. He immediately opened the card holder and checked its contents with practiced precision. Every identification card remained inside. Every credential rested exactly where it belonged. Even the folded handwritten note had not been disturbed. Damien slowly looked back at Brielle, studying her face as though he were seeing someone entirely different from the waitress he believed he had dismissed less than 12 hours earlier. For the first time since she had walked through the restaurant doors that morning, no one spoke. Even the clatter from the kitchen seemed to disappear. Whatever Damien had expected to find inside that envelope, it had certainly not been this. And the certainty that had guided every decision he made the previous evening suddenly no longer felt quite as unshakable. Damien held the black leather card holder in complete silence while the rest of the room waited for an explanation that never came. His thumb carefully checked each compartment with the same precision that had built his reputation over many years. Nothing was missing. Every identification card remained perfectly aligned. Every access credential rested exactly where he remembered placing it. Then he unfolded the small handwritten note tucked between 2 cards. The crisp paper had not even developed a new crease. It was exactly as he had left it before arriving the previous evening. He slowly closed the card holder and looked toward Brielle once again. Where did you find this? He asked. On the floor near your table after everyone left, she answered calmly. I noticed it while helping the cleaning crew finish the dining room. Damien studied her expression, searching for any sign of exaggeration or hidden motive. There was none. You opened it. Brielle answered honestly. Only enough to identify the owner. I closed it immediately. Several employees exchanged uneasy glances. Leonard Pierce quietly lowered his clipboard, realizing this conversation was becoming something entirely different from what he had expected. Damien asked another question. You knew who it belonged to? Yes, sir. You could have left it with management. I could have. You could have called the restaurant. Yes, sir. You could have mailed it. Brielle nodded. I could have done that too. Damien tilted his head slightly. Instead, you came back after I told you never to return. Because I believed it should reach you directly. Why? Brielle paused for only a moment before answering. Some things are too important to pass through too many hands. The words settled over the room with surprising weight. Damien looked down at the card holder again. Very few people knew exactly what it contained. Beyond the visible identification cards were encrypted access credentials connected to confidential business records, private meeting schedules, and secure financial authorizations. Replacing them would have taken weeks. If they had quietly disappeared into dishonest hands, the consequences would have reached far beyond inconvenience. Yet the woman standing before him had carried the entire package home overnight without taking a single thing. Damien's voice softened almost imperceptibly. "Did you look at the note?" "No, sir." "How can you be certain?" Leonard asked before he could stop himself. Brielle turned toward him without the slightest irritation. "Because if someone trusts me with work, even for one day, I believe I should return their property with the same respect I hope people would show mine." Harold Bennett lowered his eyes. One of the younger servers who had laughed earlier suddenly found the polished floor far more interesting than Brielle's face. Damien continued watching her in thoughtful silence. "Did it occur to you that I might refuse to see you?" Brielle smiled faintly. "Yes." "Then why come anyway?" "Because returning what belongs to someone else is still the right thing to do, even when they are upset with you." No one spoke after that. The simple honesty of her answer left nothing to challenge. Damien realized something else then. "You walked here this morning?" "Yes, sir." "You do not own a car?" "No, sir." "How far?" "A little over 3 miles." Leonard blinked in surprise. Harold quietly calculated the distance in his mind. Brielle had crossed nearly the entire downtown district, carrying something she could have handed to anyone else, fully expecting to be turned away the moment she arrived. Damien noticed faint raindrops still clinging to the shoulders of her navy sweater from the light drizzle outside. She had made the trip before sunrise simply to return something that most people would never have known was missing. For the first time since entering Belladonna House that morning, Damien was no longer thinking about the interruption during dinner the previous evening. Instead, another question slowly formed in his mind, one that unsettled him far more than the missing card holder ever had. If Brielle Sutton possessed this much integrity when no one was watching, what exactly had he failed to notice before ordering her to leave? Damien remained motionless for several long seconds, his fingers resting against the leather card holder as though it had suddenly become much heavier than before. Then he turned toward Leonard Pierce. "Bring me the security recordings from last night." The request was calm, but no one mistook it for a suggestion. Leonard hurried toward the office without another word while the remaining employees stood in complete silence. Brielle waited patiently near the entrance, making no attempt to leave and no attempt to defend herself further. She had already accomplished the only reason she had returned. A few minutes later, the dining room television that normally displayed reservations and private event schedules showed the restaurant's security footage instead. Damien watched the recording without blinking. The video captured every detail from the previous evening. There was the elderly customer reaching for his cane. There was the glass slipping from the table. There was Brielle abandoning her assigned section without hesitation, catching the man before he stumbled, helping him regain his balance, and quietly guiding him back into his chair. Damien remembered that brief interruption clearly. At the time, he had believed she had ignored direct instructions for no reason. Now the recording revealed something entirely different. As Brielle bent to retrieve the broken glass from the floor, a small black object slid unnoticed from the inside pocket of Damien's jacket. It landed beneath the edge of a nearby chair where no one else could have seen it. The recording continued. Brielle noticed the object only after the last guests had departed. She picked it up carefully, looked around the nearly empty dining room, and approached Leonard's office. The office lights were already off. The manager had gone home. She paused for a moment, looked down at the card holder, then quietly placed it inside her work bag before returning to finish wiping the last table of the evening. She never opened it on camera. She never showed it to another employee. She simply completed every remaining task before leaving the restaurant alone. Damien requested footage from the exterior cameras. Another recording appeared on the screen. It showed Brielle leaving Belladonna House carrying the same worn canvas bag she always used. She walked several blocks before stopping outside a convenience store. A young man accidentally bumped into her shoulder while hurrying past. The bag briefly slipped open, revealing the corner of the leather card holder. The young man glanced toward it, hesitated for an instant, then continued walking after Brielle calmly adjusted the bag and kept moving. Damien watched without speaking. Leonard quietly swallowed. Harold Bennett folded his hands behind his back. Another camera angle appeared, this time from a city intersection nearly 2 miles away. Brielle waited patiently at a crosswalk while rain began falling lightly across the sidewalk. A taxi slowed beside her, but she politely shook her head and continued walking instead. The footage changed again. Just before sunrise, she left her apartment building carrying the same sealed envelope now resting in Damien's hand. She walked the entire distance back to Belladonna House alone, arriving before most of the kitchen staff had unlocked the front entrance. She had spent hours protecting property that could have easily disappeared forever, yet she never once searched for recognition or reward. The recordings ended, leaving the television screen black. No one inside. The restaurant seemed willing to break the silence. Damien slowly looked around the room, noticing expressions that mirrored his own growing uncertainty. Every conclusion he had reached the previous evening had been built upon a single assumption, and that assumption had now collapsed before his eyes. Brielle had not interrupted his dinner out of carelessness. She had acted instinctively to help another person, completed every responsibility expected of her, protected something valuable that was never hers, and returned it without asking for anything in return. Damien finally turned toward Brielle once more. This time his gaze no longer carried the distant authority of a powerful customer judging an employee. Instead, it carried something unfamiliar, the uncomfortable realization that he had measured another person's character far too quickly, and the evidence proving it had been quietly waiting inside his own security cameras all along. The silence inside Belladonna House no longer belonged to uncertainty. It belonged to realization. Damien Calloway slowly lowered the remote control onto the conference table without taking his eyes off Brielle Sutton. Every person in the room understood that the security recordings had changed something fundamental, but no one expected what happened next. Damien turned toward Leonard Pierce with calm precision. "Tell me exactly what happened after I left last night." Leonard hesitated. His confidence, so firm only minutes earlier, had vanished. "After your meeting ended, the staff finished closing as usual," he answered carefully. "Miss Sutton completed every assignment before clocking out." Damien continued watching him. "Did anyone report misconduct?" "No, sir." "Did anyone complain about her work?" "No, sir." "Had she ever been written up before yesterday?" Leonard lowered his eyes. "Never." The answers landed one after another with uncomfortable weight. Damien shifted his attention toward Harold Bennett. "You have worked here longer than anyone else. Tell me about Miss Sutton." Harold did not rush his reply. "She arrives early every shift. She stays late whenever another employee needs help. She remembers the names of our regular guests. She brings coffee for the overnight maintenance crew during winter. She never asks anyone to notice." Another employee quietly stepped forward before realizing she had not been invited to speak. It was Melissa, one of the newer servers who had whispered about Brielle earlier that morning. Her face had turned bright red with embarrassment. "Sir," she said softly, "last month my son became sick during my evening shift. I could not afford to leave early. Brielle finished my entire section after her own tables were done. She never told anyone." A dishwasher cleared his throat from the back of the room. "She bought breakfast for me during my first week because she thought I looked nervous." Another voice followed. "She stayed after closing to help decorate the dining room for the charity dinner, even though it was her day off." One by one, quiet memories emerged from every corner of the restaurant. None of them were dramatic. None of them had ever reached management. They were simple acts of kindness that Brielle had never mentioned because she never expected recognition. Damien listened without interruption. Each story dismantled another piece of the judgment he had formed the night before. Finally, he looked back toward Brielle herself. "Why did you never mention any of this?" She appeared genuinely confused by the question. "Because they were not favors, sir." "Then what were they?" "They were simply the right things to do." Damien slowly exhaled. Those words echoed the answer she had given only moments earlier about returning the card holder. The pattern was impossible to ignore. She did not measure right and wrong by convenience, reward, or recognition. She simply acted according to the same quiet principles every single time. His thoughts drifted back to the previous evening. He remembered seeing only a waitress crossing the room at the wrong moment. He had never noticed the frightened elderly man. He had never questioned why Brielle moved so quickly. He had seen an interruption instead of compassion because he had never paused long enough to ask what had caused it. The realization settled heavily across his shoulders. The mistake had never belonged to Brielle. It belonged to him. He had allowed one brief moment to outweigh nearly a year of faithful work. He had spoken with certainty before understanding the truth. Around him, the employees remained perfectly still. They could see the change taking place, not through dramatic emotion, but through something much rarer. Damien Calloway, a man whose decisions were known for their finality, was confronting the possibility that his own pride had become louder than his judgment. He looked once more at the black leather card holder resting beside the sealed envelope. It had been returned by the one person he had dismissed without listening. The irony was impossible to escape. The woman he believed had broken his trust had spent the entire night protecting it. And standing there in the quiet morning light, Brielle Sutton waited with the same calm dignity she had carried from the very beginning, asking for nothing, defending nothing, allowing the truth to speak long after her own words had ended. Damien Calloway drew one slow breath before breaking the silence that had settled across Belladonna House. His voice was no louder than before, yet every person in the dining room seemed to lean closer without realizing it. "Miss Sutton," he said, "I owe you an apology." No one had ever heard those words spoken by him inside those walls. Leonard Pierce looked down immediately. Melissa quietly covered her mouth. Even Harold Bennett appeared surprised. Brielle stood exactly as she had from the moment she arrived, her hands resting calmly in front of her. She did not smile in victory, nor did she show satisfaction. She simply listened. Damien stepped forward until only a few feet separated them. "Yesterday, I judged your actions without understanding your reasons. I believed I was protecting order, but instead I punished kindness. I did not ask a single question before making a permanent decision, and that mistake belongs entirely to me." The room became so quiet that the soft hum of the refrigerators behind the service station seemed unusually loud. Damien continued without looking away. "You protected a guest. You completed your responsibilities. You safeguarded property that could have disappeared forever. Then you walked more than 3 miles this morning expecting nothing in return except the chance to place it back into my hands. That deserves gratitude, not humiliation." Brielle answered with the same calm voice she had carried throughout the morning. "Thank you for saying that, sir." There was no bitterness hidden beneath her words. No quiet accusation. Only simple sincerity. That response unsettled Damien even more than anger would have. Forgiveness offered without demand often revealed the true weight of another person's character. He slowly turned toward the employees gathered around them. "Every one of you witnessed my decision yesterday," he said. "You also witnessed what happened today. Leadership means accepting responsibility when judgment fails. If I expect honesty from others, I must demonstrate it myself." His eyes settled briefly on Leonard. No employee should ever be dismissed without a complete understanding of the facts. Yesterday that standard was not followed because I allowed impatience to replace wisdom. Leonard lowered his head. "I understand, sir." Damien did not raise his voice. He did not embarrass anyone. The lesson required no anger because the truth itself had already filled the room. He faced Brielle once more. "If you are willing, I would like to ask you to return to Belladonna House." Several employees quietly smiled with relief, believing the morning had finally reached its happy ending. But Brielle remained silent for several thoughtful seconds before answering. "May I ask one question?" Damien nodded immediately. "Of course. If I had never found your card holder, would you have learned the truth about last night?" The question settled over everyone present like a gentle breeze that still managed to stop every movement. Damien did not answer immediately because there was only one honest response. "No," he admitted quietly. Brielle lowered her eyes for a moment before looking back at him. "Then I hope something changes after today, not only for me, but for everyone who works here." She glanced around the restaurant where cooks, servers, hosts, and cleaners all stood listening. Sometimes people make decisions in only a few seconds, but they live with those decisions for a very long time. I was fortunate because the truth found its way back. Not everyone receives that chance. No one spoke. Her words carried no criticism, only quiet wisdom born from experience. Damien slowly nodded. "You are right." He turned toward every employee once more. "Beginning today, Belladonna House will establish one simple rule. Every person deserves to be heard before judgment is passed. Position does not change that. Title does not change that. Wealth does not change that. Harold Bennett smiled to himself. Melissa wiped away a tear before anyone noticed. Leonard quietly folded his clipboard beneath his arm, understanding that the restaurant itself had just changed in a way no renovation or expensive decoration could ever accomplish. In the warm morning light that stretched across the polished wooden floor, no applause followed. No celebration interrupted the silence. There was only the unmistakable feeling that dignity had quietly reclaimed its place inside Belladonna House, and everyone present understood they had just witnessed something far more valuable than a returned wallet or a restored job. They had witnessed respect being earned through humility. The morning meeting ended without another word, but its impact lingered long after everyone returned to work. Brielle Sutton accepted Damian Calloway's invitation to return, not because she needed anyone's approval, but because she believed people should be allowed the opportunity to grow after recognizing their mistakes. She quietly tied on a fresh black apron, greeted the kitchen staff with the same gentle smile she had always worn, and stepped back onto the dining room floor as though nothing extraordinary had happened. Yet everything had changed. The employees who had whispered about her only an hour earlier now greeted her with genuine respect. Melissa apologized privately for her careless words, and Brielle accepted the apology with quiet grace, never mentioning the incident again. Harold Bennett smiled every time he opened the front door for arriving guests because he knew he had witnessed a lesson that would stay with him for the rest of his career. Leonard Pierce began holding brief meetings before every evening shift, reminding his team that professionalism was measured not only by efficiency, but also by fairness. Weeks passed, and Belladonna House developed a reputation that reached far beyond exceptional food and elegant service. Guests often commented on something they could not quite describe. There was a different atmosphere inside the restaurant, one built upon genuine respect rather than silent pressure. Employees helped one another without being asked. Managers listened before making decisions. New servers were taught that every customer deserved kindness, but every coworker deserved it as well. Damian noticed those changes every time he visited. He no longer walked through the dining room, seeing only polished tables and perfect service. He began noticing the people whose quiet work made every evening possible. He learned the names of dishwashers, hosts, cooks, and cleaners. He thanked employees who had once believed they were invisible. Sometimes he caught himself watching Brielle from across the room as she calmly assisted an elderly guest, encouraged a nervous new server, or carried a heavy tray with the same steady confidence she had always possessed. Nothing about her had changed because of that morning. She had never needed recognition to practice integrity. The change had happened within everyone else. One rainy afternoon, nearly 6 months later, a young waitress accidentally spilled a glass of iced tea near one of the busiest tables during lunch service. The restaurant instantly fell silent as panic spread across her face. She expected embarrassment. She expected anger. Instead, Damian calmly stood, handed her a neatly folded linen towel, and asked only one question. "Is anyone hurt?" When she quietly answered no, he smiled gently and said, "Then let us clean this up together." The dining room relaxed almost immediately. Brielle watched from across the room, and for the first time since she had started working there, she allowed herself a small smile that reached her eyes. She recognized that moment for what it truly was. It was never about the return card holder. It was never about getting her job back. It was about proving that one thoughtful act, carried out without expectation of reward, could quietly reshape the character of another human being. Before leaving that afternoon, Damian paused beside the entrance where Brielle was helping an elderly couple into their coats. "Thank you," he said simply. Brielle nodded. "For what, sir?" He looked around the restaurant filled with conversation, laughter, and employees working together with quiet confidence. "For reminding me that the strongest leaders are not the ones who never make mistakes. They are the ones willing to learn from them." Brielle watched the front door close behind him before returning to her work with the same quiet dignity she had carried from the very beginning. Some victories never arrive with applause. Some lessons are never taught through speeches. They appear in ordinary moments, through ordinary people, until an entire room remembers what respect truly looks like. And on that ordinary morning, everyone inside Belladonna House learned that dignity does not need to raise its voice to change the world. If this story touched your heart, please take a moment to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and share it with someone who believes that kindness and respect still matter, because sometimes the smallest acts leave the greatest legacy.